the market exists to serve the country. The country does not exist to serve the market. And the challenge is, what do you do when something is good for the market, but not good for the country? And that's the challenge you said.
Well, the bigger challenge is to think about it this way. The Cold War ends, and everyone feels like, all right, democracy is won. Everyone's going to be a free enterprise liberal democracy. We won, they lost, and that's the way it's going to be. And the market is going to replace nation state as sort of the regulator of human affairs. That two countries that are deeply intertwined in trade and so forth are just not going to go to war because they're making too much money off each other. I think that was ahistoric. I think that did not account for human nature. Germany had substantial trade with many of the countries in Europe that they ended up bombing and trying to destroy and triggered that conflict. So there are plenty of examples about why that doesn't work. And for about 25 or 30 years, America was the only superpower in the world for a variety of reasons. And it allowed us to make a lot of mistakes. We did some things well, but we also made some mistakes. And then we reached this new era that, frankly, is normal. It is normal to have great power competition. Throughout human history, we've always had it, and we're back to that. China, to some extent Russia, these are nations, and I would add Iran into this, have their own aims and goals about what they want to be. They're different. And they look at the world as it's currently constructed, what they see as a U.S.-led Western order, both economic and geopolitical, and it's like, it's not our order. Now, we want to benefit from it. We want to benefit from the elements of it that are good for us, but we want to change it, and we want to change it to either, A, have more influence, or B, offer an alternative to it. And so that's what you see emerging in the world stage. As part of that process, they have figured out a way to play the capitalism against us. I believe in the free market. I think it is not just the greatest engine of prosperity in human history. Asia is a perfect example of it, but it always finds the most efficient outcome, which is generally the outcome you want when you're making decisions about where to invest money. The challenge becomes, and for decades this wasn't an issue, but now it is, the challenge becomes, what happens when the most efficient outcome and the national interest are in conflict? Because It is more efficient to buy the active ingredients in our generic medications from China. There's a lot of things that are more efficient to make somewhere else or source from somewhere else. It is not in our national interest to be dependent on critical things, and there are some industries that you have to have either a native capacity or an allied capacity, especially in a time of conflict. And that's the point where we've reached right now, and I think we're late to it, and so we have a lot of work to do in that regard. So really the challenge is, how do you preserve that free market capitalist instinct, general guideline, but within the context of accommodating, not just accommodating, but accounting for the national interest. The national interest is my responsibility and our responsibility in government, and our policies have to be aligned that way.
What did you think that we saw the Biden administration kind of trying to get their arms around this with this supply chain initiative this week, particularly on pharmaceuticals?
On the defense,
using the defense authorization and the powers of the presidency to try to force supply chains back into this country. Is that a good idea? Has the Biden administration got the right approach there?
Well, I think
or
on
not
that,
going far enough?
So on that point, I think that's the right use of that tool. It isn't enough, but it certainly begins to incentivize certain behavior. Ultimately, the market responds to incentives. It's not a perfect analogy, but about 20 years ago, the NFL made a decision they wanted more points.
Yeah.
And so now you can't, like if you say something mean to the quarterback, you get a 15-yard penalty, much less hit him. And one of the reasons why they want to keep these people healthy, they pay them a lot of money. And if you just sort of breathe on a receiver, it's pass interference. And so the rules changed and the game changed. It's still the same game, but the rules incentivize throwing the ball and scoring a lot of points. And so that's, in some ways, sort of an analogy to how we need to view what the role of government is. And that is, when it comes to the national interest, I don't want government owning factories or companies, but there are things that we want in our rules to account for incentivizing certain behavior. Yep. And part of it is using tools that the administration has to incentivize the securing of certain supply chains. The key is, it has to be the product of a strategic viewpoint, not good lobbying.
Right.
Okay, it can't be like people hire the right lobbyists and we are an essential industry and therefore protect us too. We can't allow that to happen either.
Yeah, I was just going to say, business often chafes at that, right? If government is setting the rules, that's oppressive regulation, that's forcing me to buy a product at a higher cost, that's increasing my input cost to my business. Who are you, federal government, to tell me how to run my business? I don't want to point to anybody specifically in this room, but I think a lot of people in business look at government as being part of the problem and not necessarily part of the solution.
Well, it works two ways. There's also businesses that like government regulation when they're the only one in the world that can meet the obligations.
Right, they can use it to ring fence their own business.
Look, businesses, corporations are in the business of becoming profitable and returning value to their shareholders. They wouldn't exist if they didn't do that. We in government are in the business of protecting national interest. And it used to be It didn't matter where companies made money. That was always in our national interest because we were the only companies in the world that did it. The world is not that way anymore. And so we have to adjust our public policy to the understanding that there are industries that are, this is almost heresy, right? But for me to say as a Republican, but I think more people are coming around to it. There are certain industries that are so critical to our national interest that we have a vested interest as government to incentivize and be supportive of certain industries and the emergence of certain industries, though I don't want the government running them or controlling them because then that won't work well either.
You sketched out some of the history of the U.S.-China relationship. Let's fast forward to the present day. I was out in San Francisco 2 weeks ago for the APEC summit. We had Joe Biden out there, Xi Jinping out there, lots of American CEOs, the top of the top in terms of every industry and finance. I wonder what you thought of that meeting, because it seemed to me that Xi Jinping was trying to suggest that given the reality of his economic situation being more difficult than it was a year ago, that he has recalibrated his priorities. The signal he had been sending to the world for the past couple of years was that state control and sort of the health of the party mattered more to him than economic success in China. And he seemed to be suggesting this past visit that he was inverting that. Now, I don't know if he was just saying that just for the audience, but that now he was ready to signal that China's open for business again, and he needs that American capital coming back in, or at least to stem some of the fleeing of American capital from China now that his economic situation has deteriorated. Did you read it that way? Do you think that he has shifted his priorities, or was that sort of window dressing?
So a couple things. The first is I think it's dangerous to ascribe attributes of American political figures or figures elected to office to those who really, public opinion does not weigh heavily. There's not a lot of polling going on in China, right? Because, there's who cares? It doesn't matter what your opinion is. They're going to do what they're going to do. The second thing we struggle with is these guys really do have 10, 15, 20, and 30-year plans, and they don't have to have a town hall meeting to do things. They just do it. They execute, they make a mistake, they recalibrate, they go, and they have we have like 30-day plans, 15-day plans, how are we going to get out of here by Christmas, how are we going to fund the government in January plans.
Right.
And so that's a huge disadvantage. So the first point is that. The second is their broader strategic viewpoint has not changed, and their preference is to arrive at that point that they think they belong. We struggle with this. This is an ancient civilization. We are 240-something years old. Okay, this is an ancient civilization that views the last 100 years as an aberration, that believes that it is their rightful place in the world, not just to be the most powerful nation in that region, but probably the most powerful nation on earth. And they think it's inevitable. They view America and the West writ large as in decline, in late-stage capitalism, and cultural decline, social decline. And their view is that it's an inevitability. It's probably moving faster than they thought it would at some point. Now, part of their challenge is they're autocratic. So these autocracies always have this problem where as they begin to grow and prosper, people start getting opinions, right? Leaders, business people start getting opinions, and so now two things happen. You go to jail for corruption, or you disappear for 30 days, and they remind you, I don't care how rich you are, you still have to, follow the line. So I do think that part of the challenge you're seeing them internally is they're trying to control certain industries that they feel may be a threat to them internally and the stability and the governance of the party. But their broader strategic long-term view is they want to be dominant in every industry and in every technology that's key to the 21st century. Everything from precision medicine to the ability to generate massive amounts of energy and so forth. And that remains their view, and that remains their goal. And obviously their speeches in English and to Western audiences are often quite different than what you see in the literature they produce for party faithful, for government leaders, and even in party gatherings. So I don't think their approach has changed other than tactically. I think he would prefer to have a more stable, less conflictive relationship with the U.S. in the short to midterm, because the one thing that could slow down their rise would be a big trade war or worse, some sort of a warfare, armed conflict with the United States. So I don't think they want that to happen. But sometimes miscalculation leads to these sorts of things.
So how should business leaders sort of respond to that message sending by Xi Jinping, even if he's doing it in the English language to an American audience? How do they take that in and sort of calibrate their behavior in China as a result?
Well, it depends how you're viewing it. If you're viewing it for the next 2 or 3 years in the short term, then China is a market that you can still have access to and make money. If you're viewing it broader to the long-term existence of the company that you're in charge of running, I would say that there isn't a company in this room or at this gathering that China doesn't want to replace with a company of their own. at some point, now or in the future. They want that's the bottom line.
Interesting that you say replace, right? Because I think a lot of this was the point of the documentary that we did this summer. A lot of American executives look at this challenge as China wants to compete with us. What you're saying is something totally different, though. China wants to replace you.
Or leapfrog. In essence, either replace us or create a new advance to go to the next phase of that industry and it make you obsolete.
So that's not just a competitive threat.
No.
That's an existential threat for American companies.
I mean, and again, they're saying we want to be the most powerful country in the world. Part of that is we want to be an industrial and commercial and technological power. And we want to be able to tell the companies who are at the cutting edge of this industry what to do. And they start by saying, we're going to give you protected access to our market. No one else can compete with you here. We'll also subsidize. We'll also help you go overseas and cut deals where you actually don't make money. You lose money, but it doesn't matter because you're capturing market share. And that's what matters at the end of the day. At the same time as they are investing in the next phase of advance in that industry. So at some point, it's no longer a competition because they are the only ones in the world offering something. Because they've been able to leapfrog either through their own native technological advances or through reverse engineering what they can steal. So my view of it is that there isn't a single American company that China's saying, well, let them continue to be the world leader in this. They want a company they control to be the world leader in that field, especially in 10 or 20 years.
Do you think American CEOs or enough American CEOs recognize that? Because I think when we talked this past spring for the documentary, you were saying that American CEOs you were talking to were starting to kind of click into this idea that it wasn't just about competition, it was about elimination. How are your conversations with CEOs now?
Well, I think there's more awareness that this is a threat. It also depends on which CEO, and if it's someone who plans to be around in 10 years, it probably matters more than someone who's and then...
Not a lot of CEOs last 10 years.
Well,
jobs,
exactly,
right?
Just like college football coaches, except you get paid less if they fire you. You get $75 million to get fired from Texas A&M, for God's sake. That's just a pet peeve thing that I have. So going back
I would
to
take that. If anybody wants to fire me in this room, I'll take $75 million.
But
Dan, I see you there. Yeah.
But
my boss.
No, but I mean, part of it is that. But I think part of it is also it's not easy. If part of what your company does is invested in a supply chain or a production capacity or a market share, maybe not even the 5% of the market or what have you, to transition away from that takes time.
Yeah.
And it takes work, and you got to explain it to shareholders, and you have to explain it to others why it is that we're making this move that costs money and it's not a short-term return, and so that transition is difficult. But you do see it happening, and I think some of it's happening for altruistic reasons, but some of it's happening, frankly, because people can read tea leaves. They see where the relationship's headed, they anticipate this conflict down the road, and so they're beginning at a minimum to diversify so that they're not overly dependent on one market. If you were heavily dependent on China for production and COVID hit, you were shut down when they were shut down. And so people don't want to re-experience that in the context of a geopolitical conflict down the road. So you do see that shift happening, both because it's smart, given reading the tea leaves. And I do think there are some that are sort of genuinely concerned. And there's greater awareness about it today than there was 5 or 6 years ago. Across the board, I would even include academia. 5 years ago, Warner will tell you this, we did these road shows. And you'd go into a university and say, hey, the Chinese are stealing your stuff. And they're like, I don't know what you're talking about. We're collaborators.
Right.
We work together. And oftentimes it's American professors and academics. It's not, people naturally assume it's some foreigner. Somebody comes to you and says, hey, we'll give you all this money for your research. It's a tempting offer. And in some cases wasn't even illegal or disclosed, so given the nature of our laws. So anyway, there's growing awareness about it.
Yeah. I want to ask you more about CEOs, but I also want to tell the room that we do have opportunity here for questions and answers. So everybody start formulating your questions and get those ready, because I'm going to come to the room here in a second. But I wanted to ask you about this extraordinary moment that I witnessed in San Francisco. I went to the dinner that was hosted by the U.S.-China Business Council in honor of Xi Jinping. And in that room, in that ballroom, not much bigger than this, you had some of the titans of American technology. You had Tim Cook of Apple. You had Larry Fink, some of the biggest movers of capital on planet Earth. These are the biggest capitalists in the world gathered in a room to honor the biggest communist on planet Earth. And I sat in the back of the room as these capitalists gave Xi Jinping a standing ovation twice. And I wonder how you feel when you see that. Was that an appropriate response by American business? Was it a tactical response that they just simply had to do in that moment? Does that concern you in any way?
Well, I just think it reaffirms a couple things. China, when people talk about a new Cold War, this is nothing like the Cold War. The Soviet Union was never a commercial, industrial, technological competitor at the scale that China is. This is the second largest, maybe largest economy in the world, not per capita, but in gross zones. Second most populous nation on the planet, or most populous now. They're a powerhouse. I mean, they're an enormous country. So, and companies want even a small sliver of market share in China is incredibly lucrative and profitable. And I think, second, there's still this growing hope, this sort of belief, naive, I believe, that at some point China will continue to allow us maybe even to expand market share. The third is a lot of these companies are deeply vulnerable to supplies that are produced and come from China. I mean, they need to continue to do work there. And they understand that the way you do that is by being in good graces. I mean, whether it's Tesla or even Apple, others, the production capacity, if tomorrow you were kicked out of China, your company's in deep trouble. So you've got, even if you wanted to diversify, you need some time to do it, and some really aren't interested in diversifying because the model works real well for them today. And I do think it's reflective of that. I think there is still many in the business world in particular that hold out hope that at some point China, once they get rich and prosperous, are going to become just like us. That is never going to happen. It cannot happen. It is impossible. It is neither culturally nor politically possible for them to ever become like us in the context of what we are thinking. And so the sooner we accept that, the better off we are. China is going to be a rich and powerful country for the rest of our lifetimes, for the rest of this century. Will largely be defined by what that relationship looks like. And it needs to be a relationship that is balanced and in which our national interest is protected. If that is not the case, the alternative will be one in which they are increasingly dominant in all of these fields, and we are increasingly in a subservient position. Not just, everybody talks about military terms, in commercial, technological, and industrial terms. And they have some advantages that we do not have, primarily the ability to act very quickly and to execute on long-term planning. And we, on the other hand, we have elections every 2 years. We change direction every couple of years. So I think we need to recognize that. And I'm not sure that has fully penetrated. And in some cases, some people don't want it to penetrate because it messes up the way things are working for them right now.
So let me just ask you very simply, was it appropriate for American CEOs to give a standing ovation?
Well, I don't know what
to
they
Xi
were.
Jinping?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know. They did that out of respect. Is it a respectful standing ovation, or is it thank you, for putting a bunch? What are you clapping about? The guy that jails a bunch of Uyghur Muslims. Where's the talk about that? It's slave labor out of Xinjiang province. Is that what we're cheering? Are we cheering the fact that? I don't understand what it is that if they're cheering that. I mean, it's certainly not someone who's done anything that's good for America or good for the things that we claim to value, or frankly, good for an order in the world, both economic and political, that made every company in this room possible. Without that world order and without that economic global order, none of the companies in this room are possible. And he's against all that. He wants to reframe it into one that's beneficial to him and antithetical to everything we claim to stand for. So sometimes people stand and clap for someone they don't like. I refer you to the State of the Union, where half the room stands and claps for someone they don't like, at least at the beginning. With the exception of the 1 year where they ripped up the State of the Union behind the president's head, but generally speaking. So I don't know, again, I wasn't there to know the context of it, but I would think that in China, they probably view it as, these are our deputies in America, and we know the strings to pull. In essence, we thought capitalism would change China, and I think the Chinese view is we've changed capitalism, and we know how to deputize it to influence American public policy.
That's probably a great place to open it up to the rooms. I can kind of see the back of the room here, so I want to make sure that anybody who has the opportunity to ask a question has the opportunity to raise their hand. David, do we have mics in the back that we can pass around if anybody does have a question? Okay, so we have mics in the back if anybody wants to get in on this conversation. Don't be shy. This is your opportunity. We've got the senator here for another 8 minutes and 30 seconds, so if you want to get a question in. And Dwardwick up here in the front row has got his hand up, and he's brave enough to be the first guy. Dwardwick McNeil is an expert in China, and we used him in the documentary as well.
Thank you, Senator Rubio, for joining us this morning. I want to ask a quick policy question. We've seen the Biden administration pass the CHIPS regulations on semiconductors. We've seen export control measures put in place. We've also seen outbound investment screening. But my question is, what's left for Congress to do with respect to China? Do we feel like there's enough legislation being passed out of Congress. There's been a big push by Senator Schumer to put in place a larger China bill that has yet to materialize. But what's your thinking about where Congress is going to play in this competition over the next 6, 8, 12 months?
Well, I think CHIPS is instructive because I was one of the people out there pushing for something that looked like it, and I ended up having to vote against it, and I'll tell you why. Because they didn't put in place safeguards to protect our innovation. And so a few years from now, when people wake up to the reality that we invested billions of dollars of government funds, taxpayer money, into technologies that were then stolen, they're going to be pretty pissed off, I think. And that was my concern with it. As far as legislation, here's what I would say. There's a lot of legislation that people don't realize that's China related, but isn't necessarily about simply being punitive towards China. I also think we need to recognize that one of the most important things we need to do in getting this new world right is ourselves. There are things we need to do. And I'm not just talking about like improving the functionality of our government. That's certainly critical, and of our institutions. But there are things we're going to need to be able to do in this country. You know, we win the Second World War because of our industrial capacity. The German warfighting technology was vastly superior to what the U.S. was producing. We could just make a lot more of it. And I think we forget how vital that is, not just in a time of war, but for economic vibrancy. I think we need to and I've been talking about this for a long time. It's become more in vogue now. But there are incredible careers that are going to be available now in the foreseeable future that do not require, nor frankly justify, the amount of money we're investing in the traditional four-year degree as we understand it. And this is really a cultural alignment as well. And nobody wants to say, oh yes, my son or daughter is going to graduate from school and become a world-class welder or know how to work in these industrial jobs. Unfortunately, they pay a lot more than, I don't want to get into a war with all of the philosophy majors again, but I just use this as an example. I'm not anti-philosophy, okay? I even read some Stoic stuff from time to time. I'm not anti-philosopher. I just don't think there's that's not what the market is saying. God, we just had one more philosopher, we could really take off as a company. and I do think the one thing I hear a lot about is we have this massive we have this workforce shortage of skill that's just not available. And we need to have a higher education system. And by that, I include high school. There's no reason why people can't graduate high schools certified with some of these skills that make them immediately employable. And that's an example of something, I don't know if the federal government can run it, but we have to find ways to be more creative and incentivize that and create some sort of a cultural shift in the mindset of our people as well. That's an area that people don't associate directly with China, but really it does have to do with our ability to stay competitive. And I would say one more piece in that regard is just the way we view public policy in general. And that is we have to reintroduce at some level the dynamic of the national interest and economic. There are industries, and this requires more of a strategic plan than a tactical one. There are industries that are critical to our future. We need to identify what those are and ensure that we either have a capacity in our country or an allied capacity, meaning it might be in consortium with other countries in the Western Hemisphere, in Europe, or around the world, whether it's in rare earth minerals, whether it's in the production of semiconductors, whatever it might be, that we need to focus on. Again, that's not China legislation, but it is certainly relevant, deeply relevant, and goes to the heart of what we need to be doing.
Who else wants to get in here? Go ahead. You have the mic coming. Mike's coming around.
These are the guys that weren't up till 10:30 or 11.
That's right. Yeah, I left the dinner at 9:30 last night, just as dessert was being served. I think some people were in for the long haul last night.
A follow-up to the last question a bit was, there were tariffs put in place, for a lot of the backdrop that we're talking about during the Trump administration, even some exclusions that are set to expire. Just what do you see as the outlook in the near term, long term in regards to the China tariffs? Is that directionally, do you feel like there's more influence that it's that and more coming? Just interested to see what you think.
Well, I think what's fascinating is the number of tariffs that the Biden administration did not reverse upon taking on. They reversed a lot of Trump stuff, and they didn't reverse some of that. And I talked to Lighthizer about it. I thought that it was important on the tariff front. I've never been a pro-tariff person, but when that began to happen, it really was a shock to the system and sort of reset our thinking about international trade. I didn't understand why we were putting it on the Europeans and Argentina. I felt like if you're going to do this, focus on the issue. I don't think France or Germany is a national security concern for the United States. They're our allies, so I would have just focused on that. I'm not sure what their policies are going to be moving forward. I think there's some tension in that administration between some that sort of view this as a geopolitical concession they can make to China, between some that are concerned about retribution. You've already begun to see China's actually banned the export of, I think, a couple of rare earth elements already, and I think there's real concern that that could grow. So there are some that are hopeful that we can cut some sort of climate deal, with China, and that this is a good way to sort of soften it for that. And then there are others that are more hawkish about it. And I think there's real tension in the administration, as there is in our politics in general. We are living through a moment of transition where there are still a lot of people that are wed to the hopes of the bipartisan hope for 20 or 25 years that China would somehow become like one of our European partners in the outlook of the world and their willingness to live by certain rules. I think there's a growing number of people out now realize that that's not going to be the case. But that tension's still playing out in the Republican Party too, and I think certainly in this administration. And I think that's why, as much as anything else, it's so difficult to predict what decisions they're going to be making as these things come to expiration. If Trump were to be elected next November, then I can tell you what's going to happen probably at that point. But I don't know for the next 12 months. I really don't.
Who else? We'll go. Question over here. Go ahead.
Yeah, Dave Stevenson from Airbnb. What do you think about TikTok? Should we ban it?
Yeah, well, so I have a bill that actually, it doesn't ban it, it doesn't allow it to monetize. Let me tell you the issue about TikTok. Okay, people keep talking about the data. The data, yeah, it's a big deal. All these companies collect data. Everybody collects data. Everybody in this room collects data. Car manufacturers collect data. A lot of people don't know, but they're collecting data. And that's a reality. The problem is not just the data, okay? Because you can put the data, we can store it in the safest lockbox on the planet in the United States. The problem is not the data. The problem is what makes TikTok powerful is the algorithm, the recommender engine, which drives traffic. And it needs access to the data. Chinese law, not one law, but two separate laws say that technology can never leave China, which means that the engineers who control the recommender engine are the ByteDance engineers in China. And that recommender engine does not work unless it has access to the data. So no matter where you store it, those people in China have to have access to that data in order to be able to use it. So it's not the booty videos that I'm worried about. It's not that TikTok, it's not the annoying people saying stupid things on there about, drink a gallon of bleach and see what happens. I mean, I wouldn't do it, but I'm saying that's not what concerns me is what happens in a time of real conflict. Like what happens when you dedicate yourself to driving not just messages, but manipulating that algorithm. For example, to convince Americans that Taiwan is not worth fighting for. Or, in many cases, think about that. Where we know that a substantial percentage of Americans under the age of 35 are getting their news and information from TikTok, meaning what they view as true in the world is based on what people are seeing it. We recently saw this with these stupid letter to America bin Laden videos, which is, I never thought I'd live to see the day where people were saying this craziness. And that algorithm was encouraging it. That is the challenge for me in the long term, is it can be weaponized against us to influence American public opinion and ultimately to really destabilize our country in that way. And it's not just that. What do you think that algorithm, what companies in the world is that algorithm going to be beneficial to in the long term? It's not going to be American companies. That algorithm will know more about our market and our consumers than our companies do. And what I mean more is, one thing is for Facebook to know it and Twitter to know it or X, but this is an entity that has to respond to the commands of the government. They will weaponize that to influence and benefit their commercial entities, their national champions at the expense of ours. That is a guarantee. That is not speculation, that is a guarantee. And we are crazy to have allowed this to continue to perpetuate in our country. And look, guys, if we can't muster the sacrifice, for lack of a better term, of doing something about TikTok, how in the world are we going to do any of the other things that's going to be required of us in confronting this challenge? If that's too hard because people just don't want to let go of it, then how are we possibly going to be able to confront some of these other challenges that we have in the future? So yeah, I want. It's not about banning it. It is about allowing them not to be monetized, unless they're going to transfer the algorithm to the U.S., which they can't and won't do because Chinese law doesn't allow it.
We've got one more question over here.
Edmund Reese, thank you. Edmund Reese from Broadridge. Thank you for your comments this morning. With the increased focus on advantage and dominance instead of collaboration and competition, there's more fragmentation, more alliances like China and Russia. Can you share some thoughts on the relevance and importance of some of the existing partnerships and larger alliances to combat some of the points you're talking about?
It's a great question, and it's right on point. So two things. One of our great national strengths is our alliance system. not just in Europe, but in Asia. You look at Asia, Asia's had the best 30, 40 years. The Indo-Pacific has had the best 30, 40 years of its history in terms of economic advancement and so forth. Much of that is a product, not of a system we helped them to set up, but it's now their system. And it's what China is directly challenging. It's what they now want to come to be dominant over and replace. And so I think all those countries have a vested interest in protecting and sustaining their system, which we have been allied with. And so I think these alliances are critical, and our ability to mobilize this global alliance is critical to confronting these challenges, because all of these countries, from Australia to Germany, everywhere in between, some are more vocal than others, but all understand it and see it for what it is. The flip side of it is the Chinese are now the senior partner in that relationship. The Russians are a junior partner. The Iranians are a junior partner as well. And I would add North Korea to the mix. And there's a couple other places that I would align, but much smaller, like Venezuela and others. What they all share in common is they do not like a Western-led, US-led world order that can sanction them and leverage them and forces them to deal with things like human rights and so forth. They don't like it. They don't want to. And so they want to at least to be able to challenge it, not be isolated by it, or potentially replace it, which is the pitch that Xi is making to the world, is the US is unstable. They're a source of conflict and instability everywhere in the world. We, on the other hand, are a more stable partner, and we're not going to judge you or interfere in your internal affairs. So those countries, for different reasons, are all vested in replacing that global system with a new one, or at a minimum challenging it. And they are increasingly collaborating across every front. One of the reasons why Russia has been able to reconstitute its military capabilities is because of munitions provided by the North Koreans and by the Iranians, and the Chinese willingness to continue to buy their oil and help them finance a lot of this. So it's a real alliance. It doesn't look like NATO, okay? Nothing like NATO. It's looser in that regard, but nothing brings people closer than what they view as a common adversary. And all of them have a common adversary, although they have different aims. Iran wants to be the dominant. They want a Muslim order in the Middle East centered on Tehran. The Russians want to return to a sphere of influence politics in which they have tremendous influence over Eastern Europe and are viewed as a co-equal to the United States on the world stage. And the Chinese, frankly, want to be the world's most dominant country. They want to be what we were in the 20th century, period. But they are aligned, they all focused on one singular challenge, and that adversary in their view, and that is the United States. So that partnership is real, and it's grown. And it's not just military. They don't just exercise together. They are increasingly aligned on issues like trade and so forth, and even on eventually, and I think you're headed there pretty quickly, on sanctions evasion and the ability to evade dollar-based sanction system that's in place in the world today. And you see them working in conjunction. So it's a real challenge that we face.
万事不求人，私人助理、私人顾问时代来临了。六度万事，万事相助。超强博士群不断奉献专项服务，信息、财经、健康、文娱、教育、旅游、消费、科技、美食，让您的生活品质全线升级。六度世界现在体验，请去3w.6度.world。
限时免费期间，全体注册网友免费使用付费版的高级功能如下：支持论坛搜索，免费画图。第一步，点击右上角最左边的机器人符号开始对话，像图片中红框中的那样。第二步，如图选择六度万事，我们未来将推出更多的 AI 供大家选择。然后就可以与六博士悄悄畅谈了。还支持论坛内部信息搜索哦。您还可以让六博士做你的助手，帮你绘制漂亮图片。最后可以点击添加好友进来，一起与六博士工作。一起来3w.6度.world尝试吧。